Good afternoon. Welcome to On the Edge of Absurdity, How Climate Change is Being Taught to American Children. I'm Dr. Deb Morrison, and I welcome you today and acknowledge that we're grateful to gather here today on the territories of the Kumi human-speaking peoples. We'll not do full introductions to begin with. People will introduce themselves as they speak, and we will start right in. So we understand that the National Center for Science Education has been tracking climate change education in the United States for some time. So we'll start with Anne. Can you let us know a little bit about a couple of the findings of the reports in this area?
Sure. My name's Anne Reid. I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for Science Education, and we carry out surveys every few years on the teaching of climate change and evolution. And the most recent climate change survey, I'll just tell you a few of the bigger messages. We surveyed biology, chemistry, physics, and earth science teachers. We found that earth science teachers, about 90% were covering climate change, about 70% of biology teachers, and about 30% each of chemistry and physics teachers. And we found that about 50% of those teachers were telling their students that what they were telling their students was consistent with the scientific consensus. About 40% of the teachers were sending their teachers mixed messages, so they were saying both, that many scientists believe that climate change is real and humans are responsible, and that some scientists don't think that. So they were telling them both those things. And about 10% were telling them that climate change is a hoax or wasn't happening. So that's not good. You had 50% of the teachers sending mixed messages or worse. And then the other thing that was really striking is how many of the teachers themselves had misconceptions about climate change. Just one quick example, we asked what percentage of climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and humans are responsible. We gave quintiles, so the top number that they could answer would be 80 to 100%, which would be correct. Only 40% of teachers chose that. So that suggests that there are really a lot of teachers out there who are themselves not comfortable with the science, not familiar with the science. That's not surprising because almost all of the teachers said they'd never had any formal education in climate change. So that's our baseline.
All right, and we'll come around back to this in a second. But let's ground this in the actual experiences of students as well. So Izzy, tell us what your education's been like for climate change.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Izzy, I'm in high school. And when I was in middle school, I did not learn about climate change at all. I went through my middle school experience, maybe what was mentioned in a science class 1 or 2 times, and then in 2017, my community was devastated by a wildfire. And I saw in the news, I saw climate-related disaster, climate-related wildfire. I'm like, what is that? Why is this climate related? And so I went and did my own research. I, took initiative and was like, why is this climate related? What is climate change affecting, and why is it affecting my community? And so I did my own research and learned so much just online, and I'm like, why am I not learning this in school? And so I got to high school, and I met Nancy, who does climate curriculum at my high school, and I took classes like environmental science and another class, and I actually learned about climate change and learned about the science behind it and solutions, and was like, whoa, this can be taught in schools, and it can be taught in a way that empowers students. And that kind of made me realize that something needs to change, because we can't just not mention it. It took a actual climate-related disaster happening in my community for me to then teach myself. That shouldn't be the case. So yeah, that was kind of my experience with it.
Right. Maybe, Katie, let's go over to you and just talk about your book. I know you're a journalist and you've written a lot about this. Can you talk to us about what you found?
Yeah, my name's Katie Worth. I'm the author of a book called Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America. And it's the findings of my reporting were, first of all, there's just a lot of tension over this issue. I talked to teachers all over the country, hundreds of teachers, and it was pretty rare to find one that hadn't gotten some pushback from another teacher, from a kid, from an administrator who wasn't navigating some of the politics of climate education, because it's a really political issue in the adult world, and that filters down into the world of children. And another finding was that what a kid is required by the state to learn through academic standards really varies a lot. So some states have really rigorous climate education standards, and then others basically don't mention it or tell teachers to teach it as a debate, which is really problematic, and that you can kind of roughly guess what is in a state's standards based on which party runs the state legislature, which has to approve the standards, right? So that's not exactly totally surprising, but it kind of played out in the data. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the reporting found quite a lot of influence of the fossil fuel industry, and here I will just demonstrate a few little props here. So the Oklahoma Energy Resource Board puts out books like this and curricula for kids of all ages. This one is called Petro Pete's Big Bad Dream, and it's for first and second graders. And it is about a kid who wakes up in the middle of, and finds that he's missing all of his petroleum products, and has to live his day without petroleum products, and kind of what that, he realizes that's a nightmare not to have petroleum products, which isn't exactly about climate change, but it does shape how the kids what they think about the fossil fuel industry. And there are also some curricula that do have to do with climate change and really water it down. And these books and curricula reach 98% of students in Oklahoma. So it's not something that's just like a little bit here and there. It's really a big problem. So I'll stop there.
All right. So standards, this is something that as you work in fields of education, the next generation science standards came in 2012, 2013, and have been slowly being implemented in different areas, along with the framework for K-12 education. However, they are not evenly implemented across the state. They're quite variable. And often it is climate change, evolution, things like that are considered controversial socially, that are the things that tend to get pulled or shifted in the standards. Frank, do you want to talk a little bit about the federal level? I mean, scientists have been in this space for a long time. What do we know about what climate literacy it has been like in the country?
So just to give you a little bit of context.
Who are you, Frank?
Who am I? I've been working on climate literacy for 16 years at NOAA. Very similar title for 16 years. Staying at this, we defined climate literacy back in 2008, 9, when we were told by the Academy that they were not going to touch national standards. Well, they actually didn't, because they're not national standards. That was the move before. A student in a classroom under standards before 2005, 2006, 2007, the amount of climate-related standards was teeny. After that, we built a climate literacy guide. We went through this whole rigorous process, top level of White House clearance, and then the Academy said, let's look at national standards. They used the climate literacy framework, and it's deeply in there. Now, north of 30% of the standards from life, earth, physical, relate to climate. It's a massive improvement. Even though it's uneven, the standards are an incredible improvement on what was before. And a lot of that had to do with the scientific community, with the education community, working together to really define what that could be. As we fast forward to now, Texas on the cusp of moving into that space, other states as well, other districts underneath that. So we're seeing the standards are moving very much in the right direction. But what happens once beyond the standards into the actual experience of students and teachers in the classrooms, very uneven, because we haven't done the work to make it not uneven. The scale of the US education system, and the reality is we don't have national education. It's illegal. We have state by state working across each other, And so that move requires a very strong, coordinated, uneven, it's going to be uneven. I've come to this after a lot of work. That just means that we have a lot of legwork to do. That's all that means. It doesn't mean we can't make progress, but we just have to do it in a concerted, consistent, sustained way. And supporting teachers is the next move. Because anybody's in the classroom now, got mad support from me. But let's do more.
All right, Nancy, what's missing in this conversation, or what additional things would you add so far?
Well, I agree with the rest of the panel that we're just not preparing students to take on the challenges of the climate crisis. And, 54% of teens say they've learned little to nothing about climate solutions. And that, has far-reaching impacts, and as high schoolers start to choose which paths they want to pursue in higher education. But maybe what's missing from this conversation is that, climate change is not just a science issue. I like talking with my students about how it is a generational justice issue. It's an equity issue, it's a racial justice issue, it's an economic issue. It's an arts issue. The arts reflect, what's going on in our society in the moment. And specifically, my work and what I saw missing and what I looked to infuse in climate education was really empowering and centering youth voice in climate policy making, and making sure that the policies that are put in place around climate education, because it's going to affect them the most, that they have a say in those.
Thank you. So I do want to pick up on that point too. So when we're thinking about climate change, I've heard a lot this morning, and generally in my life, I spend a lot of time talking about climate change, and I hear a lot about climate science, and as a scientist myself, I'm all for the science. We should definitely know the science. But climate change itself is actually not a scientific problem, it's a human problem. And so how we actually mobilize society for that is really what we're talking about when we talk about learning systems. So let's take it up a level to a system, because we've talked a little bit about like youth experience, we've talked a little bit about teachers, but let's not leave our teachers hanging out here. Many of us on this panel have been teachers in the classroom. So what can we do or what have we done so far to support our teachers? And then let's take it forward for a minute. So does anybody want to jump in on like what have we done so far to support our teachers? Anybody want to take that one? Anne, go for it.
Well, it's, as everyone has said, it's wildly uneven from state to state. The next generation science standards are truly innovative, I think I would say. They really incorporate what we know about how science is best learned. And many states have adopted them sort of as is. Others have adapted them, which, as you said, can mean real differences in how good they are. If you want to look into that, we did a report with the Texas Freedom Network called Making the Grade that you can find on our website that grades each state's standards on the basis of how well they cover the sort of four big messages of climate change. It's real, it's big, it's us, there's hope. So how well were those incorporated? And the grades went from A to F, mostly along political lines, but not completely. Wyoming got an A+. That was a surprise. Pennsylvania got an F, mostly because they haven't upgraded their science standards for 15 years, 20 years maybe. So as an action item for all of you, I would really recommend wherever you live, look up what your state's grade is, because science standards sounds super boring, but it makes a huge impact. And we know from our evolution work that between 2008, when we surveyed teaching practices on evolution, and 2020, when we surveyed them again, there was an enormous improvement in evolution education. We had, in 2008, 33% of high school biology teachers were teaching evolution in accordance with the scientific consensus. 1 in 3. That's now up to 60%. And the biggest correlation with that improvement was if their state adopted NGSS. So standards really make a difference.
Yeah, and one of the reasons standards tend to make a difference is because if you have something named as a benchmark, there's ways to measure to that benchmark, so then there's accountability toward that. So that's the idea behind standards.
And that supports the teachers, because then when there is conflict, they can say, it's in the standards, I have to teach it, and that's really helpful.
Katie, did you want to throw something on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's this. I also am kind of fascinated with academic standards, and people's eyes tend to glaze over, but they're just so important. I would also say, like when it comes to this stuff, so Texas just adopted new standards in December. They did mention climate change for the first time, but they were radically watered down by the influence of a group called the Texas Energy Council. And so, for example, they took out the line, students would be required to learn about ways that we're mitigating climate change, and that was taken out and replaced with, now they're expected to describe the carbon cycle, which is also important, but not the same thing, right? And so that's another way, like, there were almost never more than a dozen people in those hearings, and if there was more eyes on those rooms, then maybe that would have gone a different way. So if that's another action item, is to figure out when your state's next adoption is and pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move us forward a little bit and think about what ought to be in climate change education, because, I am an activist and I like to see things actually change in the world. So let's name what climate change should actually look like. And Izzy, I want to go back to you for this. Like, what would it look like for you to have a hopeful, transformational climate change education?
I think I want to highlight what something Nancy said earlier about empowering youth, because we are, going to be so much more affected, disproportionately affected than everyone else. And so we should have a voice in policy. And I think something we can do to kind of create that voice and empower that is teach it in not only science classes and humanities classes, and teach about climate justice. I can just give an example. I took Nancy's civic engagement, social movements, and climate change class, which was such a cool class, first of all. And through a project in that, I was able to learn about writing legislation. And my friend and I actually wrote a climate emergency declaration resolution. And we, looked at all of the climate emergency declarations that had been passed in California, and we kind of took language from that and wrote our own and met with our local elected official and got him to introduce it in the California Senate, and that actually just recently passed in the Senate, which was so cool, and that came through a class. Yeah, that came through a class, and I realized youth really do have a voice, and we can use it, but I would have never known if I hadn't taken this wonderful class. So I think that's a great example of how we can use that.
And I've heard a lot this morning, and at the conference I anticipate to hear a lot in the next couple of days about all the green transition jobs and all the workforce. And I know that is critical to being able to offer solid, equity-centered options for communities as they transition from fossil fuel economies. But what does that look like in our education system? So I know, Nancy and Frank, you might want to weigh in on this. You can duke it out. Who goes first?
Well, I want to say Izzy gives me way too much credit because she came up with the idea and I guided her, and she was extremely persistent and showed all of these incredible skills that we want to see in our students when it's coming to problem solving. So you give me way too much credit, but I see that when you teach students about climate change and the reality of the climate crisis, you have to give them an opportunity to act afterwards. And if not, that falls into this trap of creating more ecological anxiety for them. And what I see as a more meaningful, authentic action that will give them skills to be participants in their democracy is to be able to have students engage on a local school district level, asking their school board to include climate literacy, or their state level, like Izzy did, or even the federal level, where our students have written 2 pieces of federal legislation. So just really looking and thinking about looking at green jobs and imagining, what we want our future to look like. It is such a huge task we're putting on these, on their shoulders. And really giving them the tools to be able to take the hold of that is essential. And I really feel like as a high school educator, I have a huge responsibility for that.
So I'm going to step back for a second because one, that was awesome. Congratulations. And 2, that's a really impressive class. I don't want to see that scope and sequence because that's.
I got you.
Is that actually the title?
Yes.
Wow.
It's UC approved.
It's my job to know this at the national level. I've never heard this class anywhere else in the school systems. And I think that one of the things that's interesting about our country is that these kind of innovations are popping up all over the place. But we don't have a really good way of sharing and learning this. But there's another dimension to this that I think I want to bring in here because it's not just on the K-12 system. The learning is happening across the entire society-wide. And it's such an important piece because our informal education systems are playing a critical role sometimes. Our media are playing a critical role sometimes problematic. Higher education playing a critical role sometimes, more often than not. But learning is happening even in business positions, in guild work that was in the first session. But the fundamental reality is that the way we learn in the society is not at all prepared for the massive transformation that is already underway. And so we're playing catch up. This example over here is an instance of where we need to go, but the full manifestation of that for all learners, all students, everyone, because there's an equity and justice dimension to this, because this is a privileged opportunity that we are exhibiting here, but there's so many other students that are not seeing that. But also, there's another dimension of all the young leaders I've worked with, is that this is not on them. Let me just make that perfectly clear, because I'm talking to people from many generations in this room. It is not on them. They are pushing us, they are asking us to do it, and they're asking me as one generation leader, but it is all of us together. It's a partnership across many generations. There are about 4 generations alive right now. We need to do this together, so we need their help. We need you to join us, but at the same time, we need to listen and learn from you as well. So it's a really important, much more complex thing. We've not designed this education system yet. So the question of how does climate change being taught in American children is emerging.
Yeah, and I want to actually take that that thread of design. How do we design the system? We've been talking about climate change education as if it resides solely in the classroom, and I think what we're hearing here is that it doesn't, right? And so as we think about designing climate change learning more broadly, and thinking about how that learning mobilizes action in the world. So whether it's new careers, whether it's advocacy and activism in your community, in your legislature, in the situation that you just described, Izzy, there are many, many people learning in that situation, right? They may be learning from you in some of that context. And so the way in which we design environments where youth and where teachers and policymakers are all in collaboration and in community with each other in learning, that's a relatively new idea, because we have historically designed systems where you learn something, you go do it in the world, right? That ship has sailed. Everyone needs to be learning at the same time and iterating and making it all better at the same time, because we are kind of out of time. So what kinds of examples do we have in the world around the idea of a system of science education? How are we supporting a system of science education? Anyone want to take that one? System of science education.
Well, I don't think we're really supporting a system of science education.
And
right
maybe
now.
it's a system of climate science learning, like not just science education, but climate science learning.
Yeah, I think Katie's work and Anne's work and Frank's work really just demonstrates that, systems are parts that are interconnected, right? And that's not what's happening right now. It's very disjointed. It's not connected. And I think that's really the piece we're looking at to change.
It is not a system. It is a system, but it is not a system because it's never been designed for a purpose like this. And so I think that the creative opportunity we have in front of us is to design the future we want and then reverse engineer back to how do we engineer a much more hopeful, capacity building, empowering, because if you listen to the talk at the lunch, there is an opportunity for us to do massive transformation. That's sitting in front of us. But what we're doing with our young people and our people is not lined up for that work. They've done the technology, the policy, the investment, they've done all that analysis. It now comes down to this part of that level of effort, but that has not happened yet. Although I heard that in that book that I haven't read yet that I got today, the indicators are there, but the work to actually make that happen in schools across our country or universities or community colleges, technical schools, we've not done that work. I've been looking at it, but we've not done the work yet. That is what we're in front of right now because we need a plan.
So I'm going to call out a couple states. I'm going to call out a few examples, and I know many of you know these examples. So got to shout out for Washington State, where I work a lot. The Climb Time effort in Washington State. New York, I know, is doing a lot more cohesive efforts. California is working on that now, and New Jersey. And so I'm wondering, why are these examples? What is it about these states that is different than other states? That they're actually, because they are actually starting on a systems level in these states. So, Anne, do you want to throw it?
Well, I'm really rooting for them.
I'm rooting for them. I'm working on them.
But I would go further than saying we don't have a system to saying our system actively works against this kind of concerted, interdisciplinary, intergenerational work. It's very balkanized, and that is a real source of pride in America, that it's local education, and that makes it really hard to make a difference. In my little corner of the world in the science education classroom, if I can give me permission to kind of balloon out in a different direction, that one of the issues with climate change is that, as Katie talks about in her book, there's been a decades-long investment in misinformation. And so students come into the classroom with a lot of misconceptions about the science, teachers have misconceptions about the science, and then you've got active efforts to continue to provide misinformation, and that kind of has moved along from it's not happening to it's happening but it's not bad, it's bad but there's nothing we can do about it, to you need to stop driving your car so much, you individual person. All kind of trying to distract away from any kind of real systemic response. And so part of what we're trying to do in the science classroom with our curriculum is have the students learn to identify those bogus arguments, to learn how to evaluate a website for is this credible scientific information or not, to vet an activist organization, is this a group that's really doing good work or not? Is it really based on the science or not? Because the internet should provide us with a way to integrate at these levels that we all desperately want to and that the school system doesn't allow. But people need to have some savvy about how to join into that system and not get, dragged down some of the many rabbit holes we've seen emerge in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that we've been trying to do in Washington State is actually to very intentionally draw those connection points between different organizations that haven't historically worked together. And this is to your point, Nancy, earlier about environmental and climate justice, and I think Margot Brown in the earlier session also had mentioned it. So how is it that we're ensuring who's even at the table to design climate change learning? because, you're going to get a very different answer depending on who's there. And so really making sure that those folks are there, that they're resourced, that their voice is really heard and acted upon. It's one thing to have youth voice participate, but if you're not actually acting on the advice you're getting from youth, that's not real participation. So really thinking about what those design characteristics look to create climate change learning that works. Did you want to add something?
I just wanted to add what Anne was talking about having oil or fossil fuel influence that is really stuck in climate education. That is happening. You mentioned the individual action piece, and I just have to really say this because I started teaching about climate change in 2004, and I got British Petroleum's materials that were very shiny at the time as a teacher. If anyone's a teacher here, when you get curriculum in the mail and it's shiny and you can just plug it in right away and you're like, okay, I'm gonna go, because you don't have time. And a lot of times climate can feel like one more thing that you have to add onto content that you already can't cover. So I felt that way in 2004 and rolled out this whole program on having my students really look at their own personal carbon footprint until one day a student called me out and said that he was on free and reduced lunch and that he could not lower his carbon footprint because he doesn't get to choose what he eats for lunch. And Priuses were just coming out during that time, and a couple kids in class were talking about I'm going to try to get my parents to buy a Prius, and another kid's like, we have one car for 8 people. And I realized that I was teaching it all wrong. And that's where I felt like I saw that it was almost putting the blame and shifting the blame onto individuals and onto individual children. And so that piece I just can't say. The PR campaign around it was so brilliant that you just really can't open a science textbook anywhere that does include climate change that does not include the carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're talking about there is a known challenge that you mentioned too, Anne, of the individual to collective action, organizational change. And we've heard some wonderful examples here at the conference about what collective action looks like. But we really, in terms of hope and, actual positive education for youth, we need to focus on that collective action component, because if we focus on individual only, then we tend to localize the problem in students, and that's very overwhelming for youth. And depending on what grade you're teaching, it can be even worse. We have about a little over 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if we can actually think about, if you wanted to name something that would be the best supports for equitable, effective, potentially even transformative, let's dream big, climate change learning, what would that look like? And so anybody can start. What would your 1 or 2 things be that you'd want?
I'll start because I'll be quick. Time. Give teachers time. Time equals funding. Give teachers funding so they have time. Give them funding so they can purchase materials that are maybe new and cutting edge and really addressing climate from the different perspective. Textbooks are extremely expensive. School districts have a huge problem trying to purchase them. Funding will be transformational for climate education. It falls down to so many different things. The individual teacher, the magic happens in the classroom, I see a lot. That teacher can't do that if they have materials that are influenced by the fossil fuel industry and there's no teacher training. So funding.
I have to agree with that one, just because we're up to $5 million a year for Washington State for professional learning for teachers, and it's making a difference.
Yeah, my organization has bet big on teacher development. That if you give teachers a set of fabulous resources that they can go right into their classroom and use, that teach their students how to evaluate scientific evidence and correct their misconceptions on their own, give those teachers that training so that they have the confidence to cover a topic even in Oklahoma or Texas where they might be a little nervous about doing it. But it's a heavy lift. There are 34,000 high school biology teachers in the United States, and that's just one little segment of that market. So getting all those teachers professionally trained is a big challenge, but it'll make a huge difference.
So there's a slightly different perspective I have on this. Right now, the latest data on this was 2019, 65% of the population are under a climate action plan of some level of society, whether it's municipal, county, state. 65%, that was 2019. One of the emerging best practices is the merger of a climate action plan, say a city, a county, and their school systems. Because the school system is actually one of the easiest places for a leader, whether it's a county leader, a city leader, because they oversee that school system directly. They need huge help implementing that climate action plan. All too often, a mayor, a county commissioner, or a county executive do not see that education enterprise as an ally to the heavy transformation they're trying to do. It's starting to emerge. But the how you're going to get time and how you're going to get dollars is because it's directly connected to that activity. We're in a center in the United States of climate transformation right here in San Diego, right here. The school systems are starting to wake up, but it's organic. It didn't come from the city governments or the city's government. It's coming from the students, and the educators are pushing for it, or the PTAs are pushing for it, or someone else is pushing for it. But it's not directly connected to the direct actions of that community. This is an emerging important practice because it's not like we need to get them to pass a policy. That's been passed. They need help with the all of society transformation, and there's a lot of work to do that. That practice is showing up in places, but it needs to be comprehensive, because that's how you get the time, the dollars, because they're valuable. You're valuable. All students are valuable. 1 in 4 people in this nation is a student. 1 in 4. That's a big, big lift.
Well, I mean, I may be a little biased, but I was just gonna say, like, empowering youth. It's just, like, learning about it is just such an important thing, and I feel like also just making it required for everyone to learn about it in not just high school, like middle school, elementary school. Everyone should be learning about this and give teachers resources and give students resources to take action, because that can be super empowering and super helpful.
Thank you. Katie?
Yes, I absolutely agree. Teacher resources, and also Frank has talked some about in the past about kind of assembly programs or kind of outside informal education that then come in. You kind of like can bypass teacher trainings, which is really resource intensive, and and like changing the state standards, which is like this whole long process, but like kind of getting kids to care about it and then demand it of their schools is really important. But I also want to mention textbooks. For most of the 20th century, most textbooks did a terrible job with evolution, just really shockingly and unethically poor. Not because they didn't know what the science was. I mean, evolution is the organizing principle of biology, but for most of the 20th century, most biology textbooks avoided discussing evolution in a robust way because they knew they wouldn't sell their books, or it's not even that they weren't selling their books, it's that they worried they wouldn't sell their books, right? And like, I think that we need to force them, hold them accountable for creating good products that are true to the science, that they know to be true, and aren't just cowardly kind of, like doing the both sidesism that they currently do. So we know that the textbooks, I've read dozens of textbooks now of the most popular textbooks in the country, and they're almost uniformly bad on this issue, and that's unacceptable. So, and like there's beautiful, brilliant teachers like Nancy out there, but then there's also, for every one of her, there's one that's just having the kids read chapter by chapter, and like those kids deserve good information too.
Thank you. So across this issue, we really need to think as well, I think the last point I would put in about collaboration. So it's been mentioned a number of different times in different ways. We need to work across sectors. So thinking about how teachers, students, business, local governments, and at all different scales are being able to work to build systems of support, to think together about this issue, and work at the local scale. I agree very much with one of the prior speakers that the local scale is where we need to do this, but we also need to be having these systems of support across the nation. So thank you all very much for your time being here today, and we will call that.